The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the marble floor of the Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall, each shard of light dancing like broken promises. Sophia Chen Morrison stood at the edge of the charity gala's glittering crowd, her emerald silk gown, a piece she'd commissioned from a small designer in Queens, not Fifth Avenue, rustling softly as she adjusted the vintage pearl necklace at her throat. The pearls had belonged to her grandmother, Margaret Chen, the woman who'd raised her with calloused hands and infinite love after her mother's death when Sophia was 7. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now owned more money than most countries' GDP, yet felt more alone than she had sleeping on Margaret's threadbare couch in Chinatown, dreaming of Columbia University acceptance letters and medical school applications that seemed impossibly out of reach. That was before Margaret's death 6 months ago, before the reading of the will that changed everything, before her father, Dr. Richard Morrison, renowned cardiac surgeon and pillar of Manhattan society, looked at her with disgust and said words that still echoed in her dreams. "You manipulated a dying old woman. You're no daughter of mine." Now, as she surveyed the sea of designer gowns and $1,000 tuxedos, Sophia caught sight of her reflection in the museum's towering windows. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity Margaret had taught her, shoulders straight, despite the weight of whispered gossip that followed her everywhere since the inheritance became public knowledge. Her black hair was swept into an elegant chignon, revealing the delicate gold earrings, another gift from Margaret, that caught the light when she turned her head. These weren't the flashy diamonds the other women wore, but they held stories, memories of Saturday mornings spent in Margaret's tiny kitchen, learning to make dumplings while her grandmother shared tales of surviving the Cultural Revolution and building a new life in America with nothing but determination and hope. "Ms. Chen Morrison?" A voice interrupted her reverie. Sophia turned to find James Wellington, Margaret's longtime attorney, and the man who delivered the news that turned her world upside down. At 65, James possessed the kind of old money elegance that came from generations of quiet power. Silver hair perfectly styled, wire-rimmed glasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a gentle smile that had been her anchor during the months of legal battles that followed Margaret's death. "James," she said, offering a genuine smile that transformed her features from merely striking to luminous. "I wasn't sure you'd make it tonight." "Your grandmother would have wanted me here," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of friendship with Margaret. "She believed in supporting causes that mattered, even when, especially when, it wasn't popular to do so." He gestured toward the elegant banner hanging above the entrance. Children's Medical Research Foundation annual gala supporting rare disease treatment for underprivileged families. The foundation had been Margaret's passion project, one she had supported quietly for years, donating small amounts from her modest savings account to help children whose families couldn't afford experimental treatments. Now, thanks to Margaret's inheritance, money that had come from decades of shrewd investments in tech stocks that everyone had told her were too risky, too volatile for an elderly Chinese immigrant who cleaned office buildings at night and took care of other people's children during the day, Sophia had pledged $5 million to expand the foundation's reach. She would have loved seeing this, Sophia murmured, watching children from the foundation's program perform a small concert near the museum's ancient Egyptian artifacts. 8-year-old Maria Santos, whose rare genetic condition had left her wheelchair-bound but whose voice could make angels weep, was leading the chorus in a rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," that half the audience discreetly wiping their eyes. But even as Sophia felt Margaret's presence in the room, in the joy of the children and the hope radiating from their families, she couldn't ignore the knot of tension in her stomach.
She'd known when she accepted the foundation's invitation to be their guest of honor that there was a chance her father would be here. Dr. Richard Morrison had been a major donor to children's medical charities for decades, his name engraved on plaques throughout the city's most prestigious hospitals. "Sophia," James said quietly, his hand touching her elbow with gentle warning, "I should probably mention—"
"Dr. Morrison is here," she finished, having spotted her father's distinctive profile near the auction tables. Even at 62, Richard Morrison commanded attention wherever he went. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair that made him look like a senator or a movie star playing a surgeon, he wore his success like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored and impossible to ignore. He was examining a piece of ancient pottery with the same intense focus he'd once brought to studying her report cards, back when she was still his daughter, back when he'd believed her achievements reflected well on the Morrison name. "With his wife?" James added carefully. Sophia's breath caught. Victoria Morrison, née Victoria Sterling, 35 years old, former pharmaceutical sales representative who'd met Richard during a conference on cardiac innovations and married him 8 months after his divorce from Sophia's mother was finalized. Sophia had never met Victoria face-to-face. Their only interaction had been through lawyers during the bitter disputes that followed Margaret's death, when Victoria had challenged the will, claiming that Margaret's mental capacity had been compromised by age and that Sophia had exercised undue influence. The legal battles had been brutal. Victoria's attorneys had painted Sophia as a manipulative opportunist who'd isolated an elderly woman from her real family, meaning Richard, who hadn't spoken to his own mother-in-law in over 15 years, not since the divorce when Margaret had made it clear she blamed him for destroying her daughter's marriage and abandoning his responsibilities as a father. "She doesn't know I'm here," Sophia said, more to herself than to James. "The foundation didn't think to mention it. They were so thrilled about your donation, they might have overlooked the family connections." The irony was exquisite and painful. Sophia had chosen to honor Margaret's memory by supporting sick children, the same cause that had drawn her father to medicine in the first place. She remembered being 10 years old, visiting Richard at the hospital, watching him explain a procedure to worried parents with infinite patience and kindness. That man seemed like a hero to her then, someone who saved lives and gave hope to families facing their darkest hours. But that was before the divorce, before her father decided that his image mattered more than his relationships, before he chose his new life over the messiness of staying connected to the family he'd left behind. Margaret had stepped in without hesitation, becoming both grandmother and guardian to a grieving little girl who couldn't understand why Daddy didn't want to see her anymore, why Mommy had died, why the world felt so unstable and frightening. "Miss Chen Morrison?" Another voice interrupted, this one belonging to Dr. Sarah Kim, the foundation's director. Sarah was a tiny woman in her 40s whose energy and passion made her seem much larger than her 5-foot frame. She'd been one of Margaret's favorite people, someone who'd visited the older woman regularly, bringing updates about the children her donations were helping and photos of families whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. "Dr. Kim," Sophia said, genuinely pleased to see her. "The children were magnificent tonight. Maria specifically asked to sing for Miss Margaret's granddaughter," Sarah said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandmother used to bring her books. Did you know that? Every month a new story about brave princesses and clever girls who saved the day." The image hit Sophia like a physical blow. Margaret, bent with arthritis but determined, carrying a bag of library books on the subway to visit sick children she'd never met but loved like family. It was so perfectly Margaret, so completely in character for the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for Sophia's private school education, who'd sat up nights helping with homework in her broken English while pushing Sophia to achieve dreams that seemed impossible for a working-class girl from Chinatown. "She never told me," Sophia whispered. "She was modest about her kindness," Sarah replied. "But the children remember. Their families remember. Your donation tonight, it's going to fund an entire new wing of research. We'll be able to help children whose conditions are so rare that pharmaceutical companies won't invest in treatments because there's no profit in saving just a few lives. The weight of responsibility settled on Sophia's shoulders like a familiar blanket. Margaret had trusted her with this wealth not for personal indulgence, but for purpose. Every dollar came with the unspoken expectation that it would be used to build the kind of world Margaret had dreamed of. One where a child's life wasn't determined by their parents' bank account, where being different didn't mean being forgotten. "There's something else," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "Dr. Morrison has been asking about you. He seems, I'm not sure how to describe it, surprised, confused. He didn't know you were going to be here tonight." Of course he didn't. In Richard's world, Sophia had ceased to exist the moment he accused her of manipulating Margaret. He'd written her off as a greedy opportunist, someone who'd stolen an inheritance that should have gone to him. Never mind that he'd refused to visit Margaret during her final illness. Never mind that he'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with his former mother-in-law's melodramatic medical concerns. "I think," Sophia said carefully, "that tonight is going to be interesting." She was still processing Sarah's words when the crowd near the auction tables suddenly shifted, conversations pausing, heads turning with a peculiar electromagnetic pull that signaled drama in the making. Sophia looked up to see her father moving through the crowd with his characteristic confidence, Victoria at his side in a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. Victoria Sterling Morrison was everything Sophia was not. Blonde where Sophia was dark, tall where Sophia was petite, flashy where Sophia was understated. She moved with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to being the most attractive person in any room, her diamond jewelry catching light like a constellation of stars. But there was something else in her bearing tonight, a tension that suggested the evening wasn't going as planned. And then Victoria looked across the crowded hall and saw Sophia. The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly that Sophia thought she might be having a medical emergency. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her red lips forming a small O of shock, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. "Richard," Victoria whispered, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Richard, that's her. That's the girl from—" But Victoria didn't finish the sentence. Instead, her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she collapsed in a swirl of red silk and glittering diamonds, hitting the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent hall. The next few seconds felt like a movie playing in slow motion. Richard dropped to his knees beside his wife, his medical training taking over, as he checked her pulse and called for space. Museum security moved to create a perimeter. James stepped closer to Sophia, his protective instincts sharp after decades of dealing with family drama in Manhattan's elite circles. But Sophia found herself studying Victoria's face, even as paramedics were called and the crowd buzzed with speculation and concern. Because in that moment, before Victoria fainted, in that instant when their eyes met across the crowded hall, Sophia had seen something that chilled her to the bone. Victoria hadn't looked surprised to see her. Victoria had looked terrified, guilty, like she'd seen a ghost, or like she'd seen someone she hoped was dead. The morning after the gala, Sophia sat in Margaret's old apartment in Chinatown, still wearing the same emerald dress from the night before, surrounded by cardboard boxes and memories that refused to be packed away neatly. The cramped studio felt even smaller now that she could afford to buy entire city blocks, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. This place held 35 years of Margaret's life, and somehow leaving felt like abandoning her grandmother all over again. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains Margaret had sewn herself, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits above the small kitchen table where Sophia had done homework for 21 years. The table was scarred from countless meals, marked with ring stains from teacups and the deep grooves where Margaret had chopped vegetables while sharing stories of her childhood in rural China, of coming to America with nothing but hope and determination, of building a life one small act of kindness at a time.
Sophia's phone had been buzzing incessantly since 6 a.m.
Reporters wanting statements about Victoria's collapse, lawyers from her father's firm demanding meetings, board members from various charities suddenly eager for her attention now that her donation had made international news. But she'd turned the ringer off hours ago, needing silence to think about Victoria's expression, about the words that hadn't been finished. That's the girl from... From where? From what? She reached for Margaret's old journal, bound in cracked leather and filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting in a mixture of English and Chinese characters. Margaret had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting everything from grocery expenses to thoughts about the neighborhood's changing demographics. But as Sophia flipped through pages from the months before Margaret's death, she found entries that seemed oddly cryptic. R called again today, still asking questions about S. Told him same thing. S is good girl, working hard, making her own way. He doesn't listen, says Victoria has concerns. Sophia paused, rereading the entry. Richard had been calling Margaret about her? When? And what kind of concerns could Victoria have about someone she'd never met? Another entry, dated just 3 weeks before Margaret's death. V came to building today. Waited outside for 2 hours. Mrs. Chen from 4B says she was taking pictures. Of what? Why? Didn't approach me, but watched from across street. Felt like being hunted. The hair on Sophia's arms stood up. Victoria had been surveilling Margaret? The woman who'd later claimed in court that she'd never had any contact with Margaret, that she'd only learned about the inheritance after the will was read. Her laptop sat open on Margaret's ancient coffee table, still displaying news articles about the previous night's drama. Mysterious heiress causes scene at Metropolitan Museum Gala, read one headline, accompanied by a grainy photo of Sophia helping lift Victoria from the marble floor. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being portrayed as the cause of the scene, when all she'd done was exist in the same space as her father's wife. But it was the smaller headlines that troubled her more. Victoria Morrison hospitalized after Gala collapse. Sources say stress-related. Morrison family drama continues. Inheritance disputes still unresolved. Who is Sophia Chen Morrison, and why don't her own family claim her? That last one stung, because it was true. Sophia had built her entire adult life around the fundamental rejection of her father's love. She'd put herself through Columbia University working 3 jobs, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in social work, and spent 6 years running community programs in underserved neighborhoods, all while maintaining the careful fiction that she didn't need Richard Morrison's approval or acknowledgement. But late at night, in moments of brutal honesty, she admitted to herself that every achievement had been partly motivated by the hope that someday her father would see her success and realize he'd made a mistake. That someday he'd show up at her door and say he was proud of her, that he'd never stopped loving her, that the divorce and remarriage and years of silence had been about his own pain, not her worthiness. Margaret's death had destroyed that fantasy. When Richard didn't come to the funeral, didn't even send flowers, Sophia finally understood that her father's rejection was complete and permanent. She was truly alone in the world, with only Margaret's memories, and an inheritance that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Hospital called. Victoria asking to see you. Says it's urgent. Sophia stared at the message, her coffee growing cold in Margaret's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic piece with faded flowers that probably cost $2 at a thrift store, but had held a lifetime of morning conversations between grandmother and granddaughter. Why would Victoria want to see her? The woman who'd spent months trying to prove that Sophia was a manipulative gold digger suddenly wanted a bedside chat? She thought about Victoria's face last night, about that moment of pure terror, about Margaret's journal entries suggesting surveillance and secret concerns, about the way Victoria had started to say, "That's the girl from," before collapsing. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her best friend's name,
Maria Santos. Not the 8-year-old singer from the Gala, but her 30-year-old namesake, an investigative journalist for the New York Times, who had been Sophia's roommate at Columbia and remained her closest confidant through all the chaos of the past year.
Girl, you need to talk to me, Maria said without preamble, her voice carrying the urgent tone she used when she was onto a big story. I've been digging into your stepmother's background all night, and there are things that don't add up. Sophia felt her stomach drop. Maria, I didn't ask you to investigate. You didn't have to ask. Someone collapses at the sight of you, and my journalist instincts start tingling. Plus, you're family, and family looks out for each other. Maria had been saying this since college, insisting that chosen family counted just as much as blood family. Listen, Victoria Sterling isn't who she claims to be. The apartment suddenly felt colder. What do you mean? I mean, Victoria Sterling didn't exist before 2018. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history, no social media presence. It's like she materialized out of thin air the year she met your father. Sophia sat down hard on Margaret's old couch, the springs creaking in familiar protest. That's impossible. She had references, a work history, and pharmaceutical sales. All fabricated. Very well done, but fabricated. The company she claimed to work for? It existed, but they have no record of a Victoria Sterling. The references check out, but when I dug deeper, those people have interesting financial histories, sudden windfalls, mysterious payments, debts that got paid off around the time they would have vouched for Victoria's character. You're saying she paid people to lie about her background? I'm saying Victoria Sterling is a professional identity, carefully constructed and maintained. The question is, who is she really, and why did she target your father? Sophia thought about Margaret's journal, about the surveillance, about the way Victoria had looked at her last night. Maria, can you find out what happened to her medical records? Her real ones, I mean. Already on it. Give me a few more hours. But, Sophie, there's something else. I found a connection between Victoria and a private investigation firm in Miami. High-end outfit that specializes in, let's call it creative problem-solving for wealthy clients. What kind of problems? The kind that involve making inconvenient people disappear. Not necessarily physically, Maria added quickly, but legally, financially, socially. They're very good at ruining reputations and isolating people from their support systems. The pieces were starting to form a pattern that made Sophia's blood run cold. Maria, I think Victoria has been watching me for years, maybe even before she met my father. That's what I'm afraid of. Sophie, I think you need to be very careful. People who construct entire false identities and hire investigation firms aren't usually just looking for love and marriage. They're looking for something specific, and they're willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. After hanging up with Maria, Sophia sat in the silence of Margaret's apartment, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived with integrity and purpose. Every object told a story. The ceramic cat Margaret had bought at a street fair in 1987, the stack of English language textbooks she'd used to improve her vocabulary well into her 70s, the photo albums filled with pictures of Sophia at school events, graduations, birthdays that Margaret had attended when Richard couldn't be bothered. But looking at the photo now, Sophia noticed something she'd never seen before. In the background, barely visible behind the crowd of other families, was a woman with blonde hair and sunglasses, holding what looked like a camera. The woman was too far away to identify clearly, but something about her posture, her positioning, suggested she wasn't there for the ceremony. She was there to watch someone specific. Had Victoria been watching her since high school? Had she spent years studying Sophia's life, her relationship with Margaret, her father's guilt and estrangement? The thought was terrifying and strangely clarifying. If Victoria had been planning something for years, if she'd married Richard as part of some elaborate scheme,
Then Margaret's death and the inheritance might not have been natural timing. They might have been carefully orchestrated events. Sophia's phone buzzed again. Another text from James. Victoria's condition worsened. She's asking for you specifically. Says she has information about your mother. This time, Sophia's hand shook as she read the message. Her mother had died in a car accident when Sophia was 7, a tragedy that had torn her family apart and led directly to her parents' divorce and Richard's emotional abandonment. What could Victoria possibly know about Eleanor Chen Morrison, a woman who died 15 years before Victoria allegedly came into their lives? But even as Sophia tried to dismiss the possibility, she remembered Margaret's stories about those final days before Eleanor's death, how Eleanor had been anxious about something, receiving strange phone calls, asking questions about the family's financial arrangements, how she'd been driving to meet someone the night she died, someone she'd never identified, someone who'd never come forward after the accident. Standing in Margaret's apartment, holding a photo that might contain evidence of years-long surveillance, Sophia realized that everything she thought she knew about her family's history might be a carefully constructed lie. And the woman who'd fainted at the sight of her last night might be the only person who knew the truth. The question was whether Victoria would tell that truth to save herself or take it to the grave to protect whoever had hired her to destroy the Morrison family. Either way, Sophia knew she was walking into a trap, but she also knew she couldn't live with the questions anymore. Margaret had raised her to be brave, to face difficult truths, to never back down from doing what was right, even when it was dangerous. She reached for her coat, Margaret's voice echoing in her memory. "Sometimes, little flower, we must walk through fire to find the light." Mount Sinai Hospital's cardiac wing gleamed with the antiseptic perfection that Sophia remembered from childhood visits to see her father at work. The familiar smell of disinfectant and the soft hum of medical equipment brought back memories of being 7 years old, holding Margaret's hand while they waited for Daddy to finish his rounds, back when she still believed that Richard Morrison was a hero who saved lives and came home to families who loved him. Now, 21 years later, she walked those same halls with the bitter knowledge that heroes could abandon their children, that saving strangers' lives didn't guarantee kindness to your own family, that the man she'd once worshipped was capable of looking at his only daughter and seeing nothing but dollar signs and disappointment. James Wellington walked beside her, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor with mechanical precision. He'd insisted on accompanying her, partly for legal protection and partly out of genuine concern for what Victoria might reveal. "Remember," he said quietly as they approached Victoria's private room, "you don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to explain anything. You're here as a courtesy, nothing more." But Sophia knew it wasn't courtesy driving her steps. It was the desperate need to understand why her life had been built on lies. Why a woman who supposedly never met her had orchestrated years of surveillance and manipulation. Why her mother's death might not have been the random tragedy she'd believed it to be. The private room was exactly what Sophia expected for the wife of Dr. Richard Morrison. Fresh flowers, a view of Central Park, equipment that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Victoria lay propped against pristine white pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than she had at the gala. Without her carefully applied makeup and designer dress, she appeared almost ordinary, just another woman in a hospital gown, connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs with electronic vigilance. Richard sat in the bedside chair, holding Victoria's hand with the same gentle attention he'd once given to his surgical patients. He looked up when Sophia entered, his expressions cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been guilt before settling on cold, professional courtesy. "Sophia?" he said, her name sounding strange in his voice after months of silence. "Victoria insisted on seeing you."
"Hello, Richard." The formality felt like wearing armor, protecting her from the complicated emotions that seeing her father always provoked. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Victoria stirred at the sound of voices, her eyes opening to focus on Sophia with laser-like intensity. Even weakened by whatever had caused her collapse, Victoria possessed a predatory alertness that made Sophia's skin crawl. "You came," Victoria whispered, her voice hoarse but carrying an undertone of satisfaction that suggested this meeting was exactly what she'd wanted. "You said you had information about my mother." Sophia remained standing near the door, every instinct screaming at her to run. But Margaret's voice echoed in her memory. "Truth is like water, little flower. It always finds a way to surface." Victoria glanced at Richard, some silent communication passing between them. Then she looked back at Sophia with eyes that held 20 years of secrets. "Your mother didn't die in an accident," Victoria said simply. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. James stepped closer, his protective instincts sharp, while Richard stared at his wife with an expression of shock and growing horror. "Victoria, what are you saying?" Richard's voice carried the authority he used with difficult patience, but underneath was a tremor of fear. "I'm saying it's time for the truth." Victoria's grip on Richard's hand tightened. "Eleanor Chen Morrison was murdered, and I know who killed her." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of medical equipment. Sophia felt the world tilt around her, everything she'd believed about her family history crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. "You're lying," she whispered. But even as she said it, she remembered Margaret's stories about her mother's final days. The anxiety, the strange phone calls, the mysterious meeting that had ended in death. "Your mother discovered something she shouldn't have," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "About your father's research, about his connections to certain pharmaceutical companies, about experimental treatments being tested on children without proper oversight." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Victoria, stop! You don't know what you're talking about!" But Victoria ignored him, her attention fixed on Sophia. "Your mother arranged to meet with a journalist the night she died. She never made it to that meeting because her car was run off the road by a drunk driver who disappeared into the night and was never found. The police investigated," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was an accident. A tragedy, but an accident." Victoria turned to look at her husband with something approaching pity. "Richard, you never wondered why the other driver's vehicle was never found? Why there were no witnesses despite the accident happening on a busy road? Why Eleanor's briefcase disappeared from the scene?" Sophia felt like she was drowning in revelations, each truth more devastating than the last. "How do you know all this?" "Because," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "because I was hired to make sure Eleanor's story never came to light." The admission hung in the air like toxic gas. James immediately stepped forward, his legal instincts engaged. "Mrs. Morrison, I strongly advise you not to continue without attorney present."
But Victoria laughed, a bitter sound that contained no humor. "It's too late for attorneys, James. It's too late for everything." She looked back at Sophia with something that might have been remorse. "I was 25 years old, fresh out of a very expensive training program for what my handlers called reputation management specialists. Eleanor Morrison was my first major assignment." "Training program?" Sophia's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "Think of it as finishing school for sociopaths," Victoria said. "We learned how to create false identities, how to infiltrate families and social circles, how to neutralize threats to our clients' interests." Eleanor's investigation threatened a network of doctors and pharmaceutical executives who were making billions from experimental treatments. She had to be stopped. Richard had gone pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the bed's safety rail. "Victoria, what are you saying? What did you do?" "I didn't kill her directly. I'm not a murderer. I'm a manipulator. My job was to get close to Eleanor, gain her trust, find out what she knew and who she'd told. But Eleanor was smarter than we anticipated. She kept her investigation secret, even from you, Richard. She knew you were involved." "I wasn't. I never—" Richard's voice broke. "You were taking payments from Meridian Pharmaceuticals to fast-track approval for pediatric cardiac procedures that hadn't completed safety trials. Children died, Richard. Eleanor found the records." Sophia sank into the room's other chair, her legs no longer capable of supporting her weight. Her father, the man she'd idolized as a child, whose approval she'd craved her entire life, had been complicit in the deaths of children. Her mother had died trying to expose him. "The car accident wasn't random," she said, the pieces finally clicking together. "Someone made it happen. My handlers grew impatient with my progress. They decided Eleanor was too dangerous to leave alive, even if she didn't have enough evidence to make her story stick. So they arranged the accident, made it look random, and eliminated the threat." "And you let them?" Sophia said, rage building in her chest like wildfire. "I was 25 years old and terrified. These people don't accept failure. If I'd refused to help, I would have disappeared too." Richard had been taking notes throughout Victoria's confession, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Mrs. Morrison, are you saying that you've been living under a false identity for 20 years? That your marriage to Dr. Morrison was part of an ongoing operation?" Victoria nodded weakly. "After Eleanor's death, my handlers decided the best way to monitor the situation was to keep someone close to the family. Richard was devastated by Eleanor's death, guilty, grieving, vulnerable. It took 15 years to work my way into his life, but eventually, I became exactly what he needed, a beautiful woman who didn't ask difficult questions and helped him forget his complicated past. But why come forward now? Why confess everything?" Victoria's expression shifted, and for the first time since entering the room, Sophia saw genuine emotion in the other woman's eyes. Not manipulation or calculated performance, but real human feeling. "Because you inherited Margaret's money," Victoria said simply, "and my handlers want it." The pieces clicked together in Sophia's mind with horrible clarity. Margaret knew, didn't she? She knew what happened to my mother. Margaret Chen was a remarkable woman. She never stopped investigating Eleanor's death. Over the years, she gathered evidence, built connections, slowly unraveled the conspiracy. She knew about my real identity, knew about the network of doctors and executives who'd killed her daughter. That's why you were watching her. That's why you were taking pictures, monitoring her activities.
My handlers were getting nervous. Margaret was asking questions, talking to journalists, following money trails. They wanted to know how much she'd discovered and whether she'd told anyone else. Richard had been listening in stunned silence, but now he spoke with the hollow voice of a man whose entire world had collapsed. "The inheritance," he said. "You challenged Margaret's will because your people wanted control of the money." $200 million buys a lot of silence, Victoria confirmed. It also buys a lot of legal protection for people who've spent decades covering up their crimes. My handlers thought if they could prove Margaret was mentally incompetent, they could convince a judge that her money should go to her daughter's grieving widower, you, Richard, and his loving wife. But the will was ironclad, James said. Margaret was of sound mind, and she'd clearly intended for Sophia to inherit everything. Victoria nodded, which is why they're moving to Plan B. They can't get control of the money through legal channels, so they're going to eliminate the heir. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sophia felt ice water flowing through her veins as the implications sank in. They're going to kill me. They're going to make it look like an accident, Victoria said, just like your mother. A tragic coincidence. 2 generations of women dying young, leaving behind a devastated family and a fortune that needs proper management. Why are you telling me this? Sophia asked. If these people are as dangerous as you say, why risk betraying them? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the white hospital blanket.
When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of 20 years' worth of regret. Because I've been watching you for months, preparing to help them destroy you, and I realized you're exactly like your mother. You use Margaret's money to help sick children, you live in your grandmother's tiny apartment instead of buying mansions, you work with community organizations, fight for people who can't fight for themselves. You're everything I was supposed to become before they turned me into this. She gestured weakly at herself. I'm 55 years old, Sophia. I've spent 30 years of my life being someone else, helping monsters destroy good people. I can't do it anymore. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Richard sat heavily in his chair, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James continued taking notes with mechanical precision, his legal mind already working on protection strategies and evidence preservation. But Sophia felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not fear, not anger, but a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in months, the scattered pieces of her life were forming a coherent picture. Her mother's death hadn't been random. Margaret's vigilance hadn't been paranoia. Her father's abandonment hadn't been about her unworthiness. It had been about his guilt and shame. "What's the timeline?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Victoria looked confused. Timeline? How long do I have before they move to Plan B? Sophia, James interrupted, we need to call the police immediately. Mrs. Morrison's testimony won't be enough, Victoria said. These people have been operating for decades. They have judges, police commissioners, federal prosecutors on their payroll. They've survived investigations by eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence. Then we make sure there's too much evidence to destroy, Sophia said, the plan forming in her mind even as she spoke, and too many witnesses to eliminate. Victoria studied her with newfound respect. You want to expose the entire network? I want to finish what my mother started. Sophia stood, feeling Margaret's strength flowing through her like electricity. But first, I need to know exactly who we're dealing with. Victoria reached for the bedside table, retrieving a small device that looked like a USB drive. Everything I know is on here. Names, financial records, documentation of operations going back 20 years. I've been collecting insurance for years just in case my handlers decided I knew too much.
James immediately stepped forward. Mrs. Morrison, I need to advise you that providing this information could constitute obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and... James, Sophia interrupted gently, I think we're past worrying about legal technicalities. She took the device from Victoria, feeling its weight like a loaded gun. 20 years of secrets, crimes, and cover-ups, all contained in a piece of technology smaller than her thumb. There's something else, Victoria said. The timing of your mother's murder wasn't random. She was killed 3 days before she was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee about pharmaceutical safety protocols. Her death delayed that hearing by 6 months, long enough for certain experimental treatments to receive approval and generate billions in revenue. How many children died because of those treatments? Sophia asked. I don't know the exact numbers, Victoria admitted, but the internal documents on that drive include safety reports that were buried, adverse event data that was falsified, mortality statistics that were hidden from regulatory agencies. Richard looked up from his hands, his face ravaged by 20 years of suppressed guilt. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear to you, Sophia, I didn't know what they were really doing. They told me the payments were consulting fees, that the expedited approvals were for breakthrough treatments that would save lives. But you suspected, Sophia said, not unkindly. That's why you pulled away from me after Mom died. That's why you couldn't look at me without remembering what you'd lost. Every time I saw you, I saw Eleanor, and I couldn't handle the guilt of knowing that my choices might have contributed to her death. Victoria watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. You're forgiving him, she said to Sophia. After everything he's done, everything he's failed to do, you're actually forgiving him. I'm understanding him, Sophia corrected. Forgiveness comes later, if it comes at all.
Right now, I need him to help me stop the people who killed my mother." Richard straightened in his chair, and for a moment, Sophia saw a glimpse of the man she'd admired as a child, the surgeon who fought to save lives, who didn't give up even when the odds were impossible. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Before Sophia could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Sophie, you need to see this. I found something about Victoria's handlers. They're moving faster than we thought." The attached photo showed a black sedan parked outside Margaret's apartment building. Two men in expensive suits standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows with predatory patience. "They're already here," Sophia murmured, showing the photo to Victoria. Victoria's face went white. "That's Marcus Webb," she said, pointing to the taller of the two men. "Their cleanup specialist. If he's there, it means they've moved to the final phase." "Final phase?" James asked. "They're going to make Sophia's death look like a suicide. Grieving heiress, overwhelmed by family drama and sudden wealth, takes her own life in her grandmother's apartment. It's poetic, clean, and completely believable." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. But alongside the fear was something else. A burning determination that felt like Margaret's hand on her shoulder, her mother's voice whispering in her ear. "Then we'd better move fast," she said. "James, I need you to take this information to someone we can trust. Someone outside the network Victoria's described."
"I know a federal prosecutor," James said, Sarah Chen, no relation. "She specializes in medical fraud and has a reputation for being completely incorruptible." "Good. Victoria, I need you to record everything you've told us, a complete confession with names, dates, and details. If something happens to me, that recording needs to reach the media." "What are you going to do?" Victoria asked. Sophia thought about Margaret's journal, about her mother's courage, about the children whose lives had been sacrificed for corporate profits. She thought about the foundation kids singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and 8-year-old Maria Santos asking for books about brave princesses who saved the day. "I'm going to do what my mother and grandmother would have done," she said. "I'm going to fight." Richard stood, his medical training reasserting itself in crisis mode. "You can't go back to that apartment if those men are there." "They're expecting a victim," Sophia interrupted. "Someone scared and alone, easy to manipulate and eliminate. But I'm not alone, and I'm definitely not easy." She pulled out her phone and dialed Maria's number. "Maria, it's me. How fast can you mobilize the news team? I have a story that's going to change everything." "How big are we talking?" Maria's voice crackled with the excitement of a journalist who smelled a career-defining scoop. "Pharmaceutical conspiracy, murdered whistleblowers, medical fraud involving children's lives, and a 20-year cover-up that reaches into Congress and federal agencies," Sophia said. "Plus, I've got documented evidence and a confessed operative." "Holy shit, Sophie. I need 30 minutes to get a camera crew and—" "You have 15 minutes, Sophia interrupted. "After that, the story might disappear forever, along with the people trying to tell it." As she hung up, Sophia looked around the hospital room at the three people who represented her entire world: her estranged father, her family's attorney, and the woman who'd spent 20 years orchestrating her family's destruction. "Last chance to walk away," she told them. "What we're about to do is going to be dangerous, messy, and probably life-changing for all of us." Victoria managed a weak smile. "I've been dead inside for 20 years. Might as well try being alive for whatever time I have left." Richard reached for his daughter's hand, his touch tentative but warm. "I failed you once, Sophia. I won't do it again." James simply nodded, his royalty absolute despite the chaos surrounding them. "Then let's go finish what my mother started," Sophia said, "and make sure Margaret's sacrifice wasn't in vain." As they prepared to leave the hospital room, none of them noticed the small device hidden behind the flower arrangement. A listening device that had been recording every word of their conversation, transmitting it in real time to Marcus Webb and his team. The cleanup specialists already knew exactly what Sophia Chen Morrison was planning, and they were ready for her. The newsroom of the New York Times buzzed with the electric energy that preceded a major story breaking. Maria Santos had assembled her most trusted team in Conference Room B, the soundproof space usually reserved for discussions of national security leaks and Pulitzer Prize-winning investigations.
The room felt like a war bunker, with laptops displaying encrypted files, recording equipment testing audio levels, and a whiteboard covered in names, dates, and connecting lines that looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Sophia sat at the head of the conference table, Victoria's USB drive in her hand, acutely aware that the next few hours would either expose decades of corruption or result in her death. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the controlled chaos of Manhattan below, people living their lives unaware that children had died for pharmaceutical profits, that corruption had reached into the highest levels of medical and government institutions, that a network of killers had been operating with impunity for decades.
Okay, people, Maria announced to her team, what we're about to hear doesn't leave this room until we decide how to publish it safely. We're talking about conspiracy, murder, fraud, and some very dangerous people who've killed to keep their secrets. Everyone understand? The 5 journalists around the table nodded with the grim understanding of reporters who'd covered war zones and political scandals. These weren't idealistic college graduates. They were battle-tested professionals who understood that some stories came with life-threatening risks. Before we begin, said David Chen, no relation to Sophia despite the shared surname, the Times lead investigative reporter, I need to state for the record that if this information is accurate, we're looking at one of the biggest medical fraud scandals in American history. The implications reach into multiple federal agencies, major pharmaceutical companies, and prominent medical institutions. Victoria, who checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice, looked pale but determined as she connected her phone to the room's speaker system. I've recorded my complete confession, she said. Names, dates, financial transactions, operational details. 20 years of crimes that I witnessed, participated in, or helped cover up. Richard sat beside his wife, still processing the revelation that his marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. But something had shifted in him during the hospital conversation. The crushing guilt he'd carried for 20 years was transforming into determination to make amends for his complicity. I've also prepared a statement, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, about the payments I received from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the pressure to fast-track experimental procedures, and the warning signs I ignored because I wanted to believe I was helping save children's lives. James Wellington had spent the previous 2 hours reviewing the contents of Victoria's USB drive with the focused intensity of a man whose entire career had prepared him for this moment. The documentation is extraordinary, he reported. Bank records, email communications, operational reports, medical data that was falsified or suppressed. If this information is authentic, and my preliminary analysis suggests it is, we have evidence of systematic fraud that resulted in the deaths of dozens of children and the cover-up of multiple murders. Sophia opened the small device Victoria had given her, inserting it into the room's main computer. The screen filled with folders containing thousands of documents organized by date, operation, and target. The scope was breathtaking and horrifying. The organization calls itself the Meridian Group, Victoria began, her recorded voice filling the room with clinical detachment. It's a private network that provides what they call reputation management and crisis resolution for pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, and research institutions. Their clients pay enormous fees to make problems disappear. Lawsuits, regulatory investigations, whistleblowers, journalists, anyone who threatens their profitability. The team listened in stunned silence as Victoria detailed operations spanning 2 decades. A CDC researcher whose data about vaccine side effects had been suppressed, she died in a home invasion that police never solved. A pharmaceutical executive who'd planned to testify about falsified clinical trials. His plane had crashed under mysterious circumstances. A family of patients who'd filed a class action lawsuit over a contaminated blood product. Their house had burned down with all family members inside. Eleanor Morrison was Operation Designated Songbird. She'd discovered that several prominent pediatric cardiac surgeons, including her husband, Dr. Richard Morrison, were being paid to use experimental devices and procedures on children without proper informed consent or safety protocols. The mortality rate for these procedures was significantly higher than traditional treatments, but the financial incentives were enormous. David Chen paused the recording. How many children are we talking about? Sophia clicked through the medical files on the USB drive, her horror growing with each document.
According to these records, between 2003 and 2019, 47 children died during procedures using devices or protocols that hadn't completed safety trials. The families were told the deaths were due to the children's underlying conditions, not the experimental treatments.
And the doctors involved? Maria asked. 12 surgeons across 6 major hospitals, Richard said quietly. Most of us didn't know we were part of a coordinated operation. We were told we were participating in compassionate use programs for breakthrough treatments. The financial incentives were presented as research grants and consulting fees. But you suspected something was wrong, Sophia said, not accusingly, but seeking understanding. The mortality rates were higher than expected, Richard admitted. But we were working with the sickest children, cases where traditional treatments had failed or weren't options. It was easy to rationalize the deaths as inevitable outcomes rather than preventable tragedies. Victoria's recorded voice resumed. Eleanor Morrison had gathered evidence that would have exposed not just the experimental treatments, but the entire network of corruption supporting them. She'd identified the funding sources, the regulatory officials who'd been compromised, the medical journal editors who'd suppressed negative results. Her investigation threatened billions of dollars in revenue and dozens of careers. So they killed her, Sophia said flatly. The order came from the top of the Meridian Group's hierarchy, a man known only as the director. I never learned his real name, but his reach extends into federal agencies, pharmaceutical boards, and medical licensing organizations. Eleanor's death was meant to send a message to other potential whistleblowers while eliminating an immediate threat. Maria had been taking notes throughout Victoria's confession. Her journalist's instincts organized the information into a coherent narrative. What about Margaret Chen? How did she become involved? Margaret never stopped investigating her daughter's death. She was methodical, patient, and completely incorruptible. Over 15 years, she identified connections between Eleanor's murder and other suspicious deaths. She had gathered enough evidence to support Eleanor's original claims and was preparing to go public when her own health began failing. That's when you moved to Plan A, Sophia realized. Marrying my father to position yourself to inherit the money if Margaret died. The Meridian Group needed control of Margaret's evidence and her financial resources. $200 million could buy a lot of silence, fund a lot of operations, and eliminate many future problems. When Margaret left everything to you instead of Richard, it forced them to adapt. James had been cross-referencing Victoria's testimony with public records and news reports. I found corroborating evidence for several of the deaths Victoria mentioned. The timing, circumstances, and aftermath all match patterns of professional elimination. But here's what I don't understand. David Chen said, "Why confess now? Why risk everything to expose your own organization?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried 20 years of suppressed humanity. Because I watched Sophia at that charity gala, saw her with the children, listened to her talk about using Margaret's money to help sick kids, and I realized that everything Eleanor Morrison had tried to expose was still happening. Children are still dying from experimental treatments. Families are still being lied to. The only thing that's changed is that the network has gotten bigger, more sophisticated, more ruthless. She looked directly at Sophia through the conference room's video connection. You're exactly what your mother was, someone who can't ignore injustice, who won't be bought or intimidated or silenced. That makes you incredibly dangerous to people who've built empires on suffering and silence. Which brings us to the immediate problem, Maria said. Sophia, you can't go back to your apartment. You can't go anywhere they might expect to find you. Actually, Sophia said, surprising everyone in the room, that's exactly where I'm going.
"Sophie, that's suicide," Maria protested. "No, it's justice." Sophia stood, her decision crystallizing with the clarity Margaret always said came when you stopped being afraid and started being angry. They're expecting to find a victim, someone isolated, frightened, and vulnerable. Instead, they're going to find the entire story broadcast live, with witnesses, evidence, and protection.
"And the doctors involved?" Maria asked. 12 surgeons across 6 major hospitals, Richard said quietly. "Most of us didn't know we were part of a coordinated operation. We were told we were participating in compassionate use programs for breakthrough treatments. The financial incentives were presented as research grants and consulting fees." "But you suspected something was wrong," Sophia said, not accusingly but seeking understanding. "The mortality rates were higher than expected," Richard admitted, "but we were working with the sickest children, cases where traditional treatments had failed or weren't options. It was easy to rationalize the deaths as inevitable outcomes rather than preventable tragedies." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Victoria's recorded voice resumed. Eleanor Morrison had gathered evidence that would have exposed not just the experimental treatments, but the entire network of corruption supporting them. She'd identified the funding sources, the regulatory officials who'd been compromised, the medical journal editors who'd suppressed negative results. Her investigation threatened billions of dollars in revenue and dozens of careers. "So they killed her," Sophia said flatly. The order came from the top of the Meridian Group's hierarchy, a man known only as the director. I never learned his real name, but his reach extends into federal agencies, pharmaceutical boards, and medical licensing organizations. Eleanor's death was meant to send a message to other potential whistleblowers while eliminating an immediate threat. Maria had been taking notes throughout Victoria's confession, her journalist's instincts organizing the information into a coherent narrative. What about Margaret Chen? How did she become involved? Margaret never stopped investigating her daughter's death. She was methodical, patient, and completely incorruptible. Over 15 years, she identified connections between Eleanor's murder and other suspicious deaths. She'd gathered enough evidence to support Eleanor's original claims and was preparing to go public when her own health began failing. "That's when you moved to Plan A," Sophia realized, "marrying my father to position yourself to inherit the money if Margaret died." The Meridian Group needed control of Margaret's evidence and her financial resources. $200 million could buy a lot of silence, fund a lot of operations, and eliminate many future problems. When Margaret left everything to you instead of Richard, it forced them to adapt. James had been cross-referencing Victoria's testimony with public records in news reports. "I found corroborating evidence for several of the deaths Victoria mentioned," he reported. "The timing, circumstances, and aftermath all match patterns of professional elimination. But here's what I don't understand," David Chen said. "Why confess now? Why risk everything to expose your own organization?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried 20 years of suppressed humanity. "Because I watched Sophia at that charity gala, saw her with the children, listened to her talk about using Margaret's money to help sick kids. And I realized that everything Eleanor Morrison had tried to expose was still happening. Children are still dying from experimental treatments. Families are still being lied to. The only thing that's changed is that the network has gotten bigger, more sophisticated, more ruthless." She looked directly at Sophia through the conference room's video connection. "You're exactly what your mother was. Someone who can't ignore injustice, who won't be bought or intimidated or silenced. That makes you incredibly dangerous to people who've built empires on suffering and silence." "Which brings us to the immediate problem," Maria said. "Sophia, you can't go back to your apartment. You can't go anywhere they might expect to find you." "Actually," Sophia said, surprising everyone in the room, "that's exactly where I'm going." "Sophie, that's suicide," Maria protested. "No, it's justice."
Sophia stood, her decision crystallizing with the clarity Margaret had always said came when you stopped being afraid and started being angry. They're expecting to find a victim, someone isolated, frightened, and vulnerable. Instead, they're going to find the entire story broadcast live, with witnesses, evidence, and protection.
How? Sophia asked. They'll release information designed to make you look unstable, greedy, or criminal. Falsified medical records showing mental illness, fabricated financial documents suggesting embezzlement, manufactured evidence of drug use or other personal scandals. By the time they kill you, public opinion will be that you were a disturbed individual whose claims couldn't be trusted. Then we'd better make sure our story gets out first, Sophia said, and that it's so compelling, so well documented, and so widely disseminated that no amount of character assassination can undo the damage. As the team dispersed to implement their plan, Sophia remained in the conference room with Victoria and Richard, the three of them bound together by decades of secrets and lies that were finally being dragged into the light. "I want you to know," Victoria said quietly, "that watching you these past months, seeing the kind of person you became despite everything you've lost, it reminded me who I used to be before the Meridian Group turned me into something else. You gave me back my conscience. And I want you to know," Richard said to his daughter, "that your mother would be proud of what you're doing. She'd be proud of who you've become." For the first time in 20 years, Sophia felt like she had a family again. Not the family she'd been born into, but the family she'd chosen to create from the wreckage of old lies and new truths. Now all she had to do was survive long enough to tell their story. The transformation of Margaret's tiny Chinatown apartment into a broadcast studio took exactly 93 minutes. Maria's technical team worked with the efficiency of a military operation, running cables through windows, positioning cameras to capture optimal angles, and establishing satellite uplinks that would ensure the signal could reach viewers even if local infrastructure was compromised. The cramped space that had once held a lifetime of quiet dignity now hummed with the electronic energy of modern journalism, preparing to expose decades of carefully hidden truth. Sophia stood in the center of the controlled chaos, wearing the same emerald dress from the gala, a deliberate choice that would remind viewers of Victoria's dramatic collapse and the questions it had raised. Margaret's pearl necklace caught the harsh light of the camera equipment, each lustrous bead holding memories of Saturday morning conversations and gentle wisdom shared over cups of jasmine tea. "Audio levels are good," reported Tom Martinez, Maria's lead technician. "We've got redundant feeds going to 3 different networks, plus independent streaming on 4 social media platforms. They'd have to shut down half the internet to stop this broadcast." Through the apartment's small windows, Sophia could see Detective Park's team taking positions around the building. Undercover officers disguised as street vendors, tourists, and delivery workers created an invisible perimeter of protection that looked casual but was positioned with tactical precision. The black sedan with Webb and his partner had departed 20 minutes earlier, but surveillance drones confirmed they'd moved to a building across the street with clear sightlines to Margaret's apartment. "They're watching," Victoria said, studying the tactical displays on Detective Park's mobile command unit. She had insisted on being present for the broadcast despite the obvious danger, driven by what she called 20 years of overdue honesty. The hospital gown had been replaced by borrowed clothes that made her look smaller, more vulnerable, but her voice carried new strength as she prepared to confess her crimes to the world. Richard stood near the kitchen table where Sophia had done homework for 20 years, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to reveal. The man who had spent years avoiding difficult truths was now ready to confront the most devastating truth of all, that his choices had contributed to children's deaths and his wife's murder. 5 minutes to air, Maria announced. "Sophie, last chance to change your mind. Once we go live, there's no taking any of this back." Sophia looked around the apartment that held her entire childhood, seeing Margaret's careful handwriting in the margins of old books, her grandmother's tiny sewing kit with its rainbow of threads, the photographs documenting a life built on integrity, choosing difficult truth over comfortable lies.
How? Sophia asked.
They'll release information designed to make you look unstable, greedy, or criminal. Falsified medical records showing mental illness, fabricated financial documents suggesting embezzlement, manufactured evidence of drug use or other personal scandals. By the time they kill you, public opinion will be that you were a disturbed individual whose claims couldn't be trusted. Then we'd better make sure our story gets out first, Sophia said, and that it's so compelling, so well documented, and so widely disseminated that no amount of character assassination can undo the damage. As the team dispersed to implement their plan, Sophia remained in the conference room with Victoria and Richard, the three of them bound together by decades of secrets and lies that were finally being dragged into the light. "I want you to know," Victoria said quietly, "that watching you these past months, seeing the kind of person you became despite everything you've lost, it reminded me who I used to be before the Meridian Group turned me into something else. You gave me back my conscience. And I want you to know," Richard said to his daughter, "that your mother would be proud of what you're doing. She'd be proud of who you've become." For the first time in 20 years, Sophia felt like she had a family again, not the family she'd been born into, but the family she'd chosen to create from the wreckage of old lies and new truths. Now all she had to do was survive long enough to tell their story. The transformation of Margaret's tiny Chinatown apartment into a broadcast studio took exactly 93 minutes. Maria's technical team worked with the efficiency of a military operation, running cables through windows, positioning cameras to capture optimal angles, and establishing satellite uplinks that would ensure the signal could reach viewers even if local infrastructure was compromised. The cramped space that had once held a lifetime of quiet dignity now hummed with the electronic energy of modern journalism, preparing to expose decades of carefully hidden truth. Sophia stood in the center of the controlled chaos, wearing the same emerald dress from the gala, a deliberate choice that would remind viewers of Victoria's dramatic collapse and the questions it had raised. Margaret's pearl necklace caught the harsh light of the camera equipment, each lustrous bead holding memories of Saturday morning conversations and gentle wisdom shared over cups of jasmine tea. "Audio levels are good," reported Tom Martinez, Maria's lead technician. "We've got redundant feeds going to 3 different networks, plus independent streaming on 4 social media platforms. They'd have to shut down half the internet to stop this broadcast." Through the apartment's small windows, Sophia could see Detective Park's team taking positions around the building. Undercover officers disguised as street vendors, tourists, and delivery workers created an invisible perimeter of protection that looked casual but was positioned with tactical precision. The black sedan with Webb and his partner had departed 20 minutes earlier, but surveillance drones confirmed they'd moved to a building across the street with clear sight lines to Margaret's apartment. "They're watching," Victoria said, studying the tactical displays on Detective Park's mobile command unit. She'd insisted on being present for the broadcast despite the obvious danger, driven by what she called 20 years of overdue honesty. The hospital gown had been replaced by borrowed clothes that made her look smaller, more vulnerable, but her voice carried new strength as she prepared to confess her crimes to the world. Richard stood near the kitchen table where Sophia had done homework for 20 years, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what they were about to reveal. The man who'd spent years avoiding difficult truths was now ready to confront the most devastating truth of all, that his choices had contributed to children's deaths and his wife's murder. 5 minutes to air, Maria announced. "Sophie, last chance to change your mind? Once we go live, there's no taking any of this back." Sophia looked around the apartment that held her entire childhood, seeing Margaret's careful handwriting in the margins of old books, her grandmother's tiny sewing kit with its rainbow of threads, the photographs documenting a life built on love and sacrifice rather than wealth and status. Every object told a story of integrity, choosing difficult truth over comfortable lies.
Suicide, 2011. Dr. Sarah Kim's predecessor at the Children's Medical Research Foundation, Dr. David Chen. Home invasion, 2015. The list continued for several minutes, each name representing not just a life lost, but information suppressed, families silenced, and children who died because safety data never reached the doctors treating them. But the murders weren't random acts of violence, Sophia said, taking over the narrative with the authority that came from months of studying her inheritance of evidence. They were strategic eliminations designed to protect a financial network worth billions of dollars. She stood and moved to Margaret's kitchen table, now covered with documents, photographs, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning 2 decades. My grandmother, Margaret Chen, spent 15 years investigating my mother's death. She was methodical, patient, and completely incorruptible. These are her files. Sophia held up Margaret's careful notes, written in her distinctive handwriting that mixed English and Chinese characters. She identified patterns, traced financial connections, and slowly built a case that would have exposed the entire Meridian Group. That's why they wanted control of her inheritance, Victoria added. $200 million could buy a lot of silence, eliminate a lot of problems, and fund operations for decades. But Margaret left everything to me instead, which is why we're here tonight. Because I'm not interested in being bought, silenced, or eliminated. I'm interested in finishing what my mother started and honoring what my grandmother preserved. The broadcast continued for another 30 minutes, with Victoria providing operational details, Richard confessing his specific involvement, and Sophia presenting Margaret's evidence. The technical team confirmed that viewership was climbing rapidly. Local news networks were picking up the feed, social media platforms were sharing clips, and international outlets were requesting interviews. "We're going viral," Tom Martinez reported. "Over 2 million viewers and climbing fast." Through the apartment windows, they could see news vans arriving, reporters setting up remote broadcasts, and crowds gathering on the street below. The story was taking on a life of its own, growing beyond anyone's ability to contain or control it. "This is exactly what the Meridian Group feared most," Victoria said with something approaching satisfaction. "Public exposure, documented evidence, and enough witnesses to make covering up the truth impossible." Detective Park's voice crackled through the command radio. "We've got movement from the building across the street. 2 individuals with long-range camera equipment, but no weapons visible. They're documenting, not preparing to act. They're gathering intelligence for damage control, trying to identify everyone involved so they can plan their response." What kind of response? Character assassination, legal challenges, attempts to discredit our evidence and testimony. But it's too late for those tactics to be effective. The story is too big, too well documented, and too widely disseminated. As the broadcast concluded, Maria provided contact information for viewers who might have relevant information about medical fraud or suspicious deaths in the pharmaceutical industry. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The news organization's phones and email servers crashed within minutes as hundreds of tips, testimonials, and additional evidence poured in from across the country. "We've opened the floodgates," Maria said with the exhausted satisfaction of a journalist who'd just broken the story of her career. "There are probably dozens of people who've been waiting years for someone to expose this network." In the days that followed, the impact was swift and devastating for the conspiracy Victoria had served for 20 years. Federal prosecutors announced investigations into multiple pharmaceutical companies. Medical licensing boards suspended dozens of doctors pending review of their practices. Congressional committees scheduled hearings on pharmaceutical safety protocols and regulatory oversight. But for Sophia, the most meaningful response came from the families whose children had been victims of the experimental treatments. Letters, emails, and phone calls from parents who'd been told their children's deaths were inevitable, who'd been pressured not to ask questions, who'd carried guilt and grief for years because they'd trusted medical professionals who'd betrayed that trust.
"Your mother's investigation could have saved our daughter," wrote one father whose 8-year-old had died during an experimental cardiac procedure in 2006. "Thank you for making sure her sacrifice wasn't meaningless." 3 weeks after the broadcast, Sophia sat in the same conference room where they'd planned the exposure, meeting with representatives from the Department of Justice, the FDA, and congressional oversight committees.
The Meridian Group was being systematically dismantled, its leadership facing federal charges, its operations exposed and terminated. Victoria had entered witness protection after providing testimony that led to indictments of 17 pharmaceutical executives and 43 medical professionals. Her last message to Sophia had been simple. Thank you for reminding me who I used to be. Richard was facing professional sanctions and possible criminal charges, but he'd also become a key witness in the federal investigation. Their relationship remained complicated, too much damage for easy forgiveness, but enough understanding for gradual healing. The foundation would like you to consider joining our board of directors, Dr. Sarah Kim said during one of their regular meetings. Your understanding of both the medical and financial aspects of children's health care could be invaluable. I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm a social worker, not a doctor or administrator. You're exactly what we need, Sarah insisted. Someone who understands that healthcare is about people, not profits. Someone who won't be intimidated by authority or impressed by credentials. Someone who asks the right questions even when they're difficult. 2 months after the broadcast that changed everything, Sophia stood in the same charity gala hall where Victoria had collapsed, but the atmosphere was completely different. The Children's Medical Research Foundation was announcing new safety protocols for all research involving minors, funding mechanisms that prioritized patient welfare over profit margins, and oversight committees that included patient advocates alongside medical professionals. The changes we are implementing tonight wouldn't have been possible without the courage of people who refused to accept that children's lives were acceptable casualties in the pursuit of medical advancement, Dr. Sarah Kim told the audience. The crowd gave Sophia a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but she found herself thinking about Margaret, about Eleanor, about the children whose deaths had been preventable and the families whose grief had been unnecessary. This isn't about heroes or villains, she said when called to speak. It's about creating systems that prioritize truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and children's lives over corporate profits. My mother died trying to protect children she'd never met. My grandmother spent 15 years fighting for justice she'd never see. I inherited more than money from them. I inherited responsibility. The foundation announced that evening that Margaret Chen's name would be added to their research center, honoring the woman who'd preserved evidence that saved countless future lives. Eleanor Morrison's investigation would be published as a comprehensive report on pharmaceutical safety protocols, ensuring that her work would influence medical practice for generations. But perhaps most importantly, the foundation established the Eleanor Morrison Fellowship Program, providing full scholarships for medical students from underserved communities who committed to practicing in areas where corporate influence was minimal and patient advocacy was paramount. We're not just exposing corruption, Sophia explained to the audience. We're creating alternatives to it. 6 months after the broadcast that changed everything, Sophia received a letter that made her cry. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude. It was from Maria Santos, the 8-year-old singer from the original Gala, who was celebrating 2 years of success.
Treatment using traditional protocols instead of experimental procedures that might have killed her. Miss Sophie, the letter read in careful second-grade handwriting. Mama says you helped make the doctors tell the truth about medicines. Thank you for keeping me safe. When I grow up, I want to help keep other kids safe too. The letter came with a drawing. Maria Santos standing on a stage, singing to an audience of children, with the words "Truth and music make everything better," written in purple crayon across the top. 3 years later. The Columbia University School of Social Work graduation ceremony took place on a crisp May morning, with spring flowers blooming across the campus where Sophia had once struggled to pay tuition while working 3 jobs and dreaming of changing the world, one family at a time. Now she stood at the podium as the ceremony's keynote speaker, looking out at a sea of eager faces that reminded her of her own determination 2 decades earlier. Social work isn't about fixing people, she told the graduating class. It's about creating systems that support human dignity, challenge unjust power structures, and ensure that society's most vulnerable members have voices that can't be ignored or silenced.
In the audience, she spotted faces that had become family over the past 3 years. Maria Santos, now senior investigative reporter for The Times and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning series The Meridian Files. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose foundation had expanded internationally and prevented dozens of unnecessary deaths through rigorous safety protocols. James Wellington, who'd taken early retirement from corporate law to establish a pro bono practice focused on medical malpractice and pharmaceutical fraud. Richard sat in the front row, his relationship with Sophia still evolving, but grounded now in shared purpose rather than expectations of forgiveness. He'd lost his medical license, but found new meaning as a patient advocate, working with families to navigate complex medical decisions and ensure truly informed consent. The systems we work within aren't neutral, Sophia continued. They reflect choices made by people with power about which lives matter and which voices deserve to be heard. Our job, your job, is to make sure those systems serve everyone, not just those who can afford the best representation. After the ceremony, Sophia walked across campus to the Margaret Chen Community Health Center, a facility she'd funded with part of her inheritance. The center provided free medical care, mental health services, and social work support to immigrants and low-income families, staffed by medical professionals who'd committed to putting patient welfare ahead of profit margins. The waiting room buzzed with conversations in Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and English. Families who might otherwise go without care because they couldn't afford insurance or didn't have legal documentation. Children played with toys donated by local schools while their parents consulted with doctors who took time to explain treatments in languages they could understand. Miss Sophia! 8-year-old Maria Santos, now 11 and as irrepressible as ever, ran across the waiting room to embrace her. Maria's rare genetic condition had stabilized under careful treatment, and she'd become something of a celebrity in medical advocacy circles, speaking at conferences about the importance of patient voices in healthcare decisions. "How's the singing going?" Sophia asked. "Mama says I might get to perform at Carnegie Hall next year," Maria beamed. "And I'm writing songs about kids who help other kids. Want to hear one?" Before Sophia could answer, Maria launched into an impromptu performance that had the entire waiting room clapping along. Her voice had matured over the past 3 years, gaining power and control while maintaining the pure joy that had moved hearts at that first charity gala. Dr. Jennifer Park, no relation to Detective Lisa Park, but equally committed to justice, emerged from one of the examination rooms with a family whose newborn had just received his first clean bill of health. Dr. Park had been one of 17 medical professionals who'd lost their licenses in the Meridian Group scandal, but after retraining and extensive ethics counseling, she'd become one of the community center's most dedicated practitioners. Mrs. Chen Morrison, using the formal address they'd agreed upon, despite their growing friendship, "I wanted to update you on our quarterly report. We've seen 3,000 patients this year with 0 adverse events related to experimental treatments and a patient satisfaction rate of 97%.
What about the 3% who weren't satisfied? Sophia asked, a question that always surprised medical professionals, but shouldn't have, given her background. Mostly complaints about waiting times and language barriers, Dr. Park replied. Issues we're addressing through expanded staffing and interpreter services. The commitment to continuous improvement was part of what made the center special, an acknowledgement that good intentions weren't sufficient, that serving vulnerable populations required constant vigilance and adaptation. There's something else, Dr. Park added. We've received a grant application request from a group in Detroit who want to replicate our model, and another from Seattle. The Margaret Chen approach to community healthcare is starting to spread. The phrase Margaret Chen approach still made Sophia emotional. Her grandmother's name was becoming associated with medical care that prioritized dignity over efficiency, truth over convenience, and community needs over profit margins. It was a legacy Margaret never could have imagined when she was working 3 jobs to support her granddaughter's education. 5 years later.
The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms and millions more following the proceedings online. The House Subcommittee on Healthcare Oversight was holding its annual review of pharmaceutical safety protocols, a tradition that had begun after the Meridian Group revelations and become a cornerstone of medical transparency. Sophia sat at the witness table alongside representatives from patient advocacy organizations, medical ethics boards, and pharmaceutical oversight committees. At 33, she'd become one of the country's most recognizable voices for healthcare reform, but she still felt like Margaret's granddaughter, trying to do right by the people who couldn't speak for themselves. Ms. Chen Morrison, said Representative Angela Rodriguez, the subcommittee chair. Your organization has documented significant improvements in pediatric safety protocols over the past 5 years. Can you summarize the changes for our committee? Thank you, Representative Rodriguez. The Margaret Chen Foundation has tracked implementation of safety protocols across 400 medical institutions nationwide. We've seen a 40% reduction in adverse events during pediatric procedures, a 60% increase in informed consent protocols that include patient advocates, and the establishment of independent oversight committees at every major children's hospital. She paused, thinking about the children whose lives those statistics represented. Kids who would grow up healthy because doctors were asking better questions and families were getting honest answers. But perhaps most importantly, we've created systems that make it impossible for networks like the Meridian Group to operate. When pharmaceutical companies fund research, that funding is now publicly transparent. When experimental treatments are proposed, patients have access to independent advocates who aren't financially connected to the institutions providing care. When adverse events occur, they're reported to databases that can't be manipulated or suppressed. Representative James Fletcher, ranking minority member, leaned forward with the skeptical expression that had made him famous in healthcare circles. Ms. Chen Morrison, some critics argue that increased oversight has slowed medical innovation and made it harder for breakthrough treatments to reach patients who need them. How do you respond to those concerns? Sophia had been expecting this question. It came up at every hearing, press conference, and public forum she attended. The pharmaceutical industry had spent millions on lobbying campaigns arguing that safety protocols were obstacles to medical progress. Representative Fletcher, innovation that kills children isn't innovation, it's experimentation. The Meridian Group's experimental treatments had a mortality rate 43% higher than traditional alternatives. That's not medical progress. That's systematic harm disguised as research.
She reached for a folder containing photographs and testimonials from families whose children had survived because of improved safety protocols. But let me give you a specific example. Last year, a pharmaceutical company proposed expedited approval for a new pediatric cardiac device. Under the old system, financial incentives and regulatory pressure might have pushed that device to market despite incomplete safety data. Under current protocols, independent review identified design flaws that could have caused strokes in children. The device was redesigned, properly tested, and ultimately approved, but safely. Representative Rodriguez nodded approvingly. And the outcome? The improved device has been used successfully in over 200 procedures with 0 adverse events. Innovation continued, but safely and transparently. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering topics from pharmaceutical advertising regulations to medical education reforms. But for Sophia, the most meaningful moment came during the public comment period, when Maria Santos, now 16 and a high school junior, approached the microphone to address the committee. "My name is Maria Santos," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from years of speaking truth to power. "When I was 8 years old, I was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition that affects my heart. Under the old system, I might have been pressured into experimental treatments that could have killed me. Instead, I received careful, conservative treatment that has allowed me to live a normal life." She looked directly at the committee members, her gaze steady and determined. "I'm here today not just as a patient, but as a future doctor. I've been accepted to Columbia University's pre-med program where I plan to study pediatric cardiology.
I want to be the kind of doctor who puts children's lives ahead of corporate profits, who asks difficult questions and insists on honest answers. The committee room erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Representative Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she called for order. Ms. Santos, thank you for reminding us why this work matters. 7 years later. The International Conference on Medical Ethics drew participants from 6 continents, all gathered in Geneva to discuss best practices for pharmaceutical oversight and patient advocacy. Sophia sat on a panel with health ministers, medical researchers, and patient advocates from around the world discussing how the Margaret Chen Protocols, now formally adopted by the World Health Organization, could be implemented in developing countries. The key insight, she told the international audience, is that medical ethics isn't culturally relative. Whether you're treating children in Manhattan or Mumbai, the principles remain the same: informed consent, independent oversight, transparent reporting, and accountability for adverse outcomes. Dr. Chen Wei, no relation to Margaret despite the shared surname, represented the Chinese Ministry of Health and had become one of Sophia's closest collaborators in global health initiatives. The Margaret Chen Protocols have been particularly effective in rural hospitals where pharmaceutical company influence was historically strongest. We've documented significant improvements in patient outcomes and family satisfaction. The success in China felt especially meaningful to Sophia, connecting her work to Margaret's country of origin and honoring the journey that had brought her grandmother to America with nothing but hope and determination. After the panel, Sophia walked along Lake Geneva, thinking about the strange path that had led from Margaret's tiny apartment to this international stage. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, now in her 3rd year of medical school. Sophie, saw your conference speech online. Margaret would be so proud. Also, I got matched for pediatric cardiology residency at Columbia. Dr. Richard wants to work with me on developing new patient advocacy protocols. The mention of Richard, now Dr. Richard again after completing medical ethics training and community service requirements, brought a smile to Sophia's face. Their relationship had evolved from estrangement through tentative reconciliation to genuine partnership in medical reform efforts. He would never be the father she'd dreamed of as a child, but he'd become something perhaps more valuable, a collaborator in the work of ensuring that other families didn't suffer the losses theirs had endured.
Her phone rang with a call from James Wellington, now 72 and theoretically retired but more active than ever in pro bono legal work. Sophia, you need to see the news. The last of the Meridian Group defendants was sentenced today. Marcus Webb got life without parole for the murder of Eleanor Morrison and 6 other victims. The news should have felt like closure, but instead it felt like continuation. Justice not as an ending, but as a foundation for building something better. 10 years later. The Margaret Chen Medical Ethics Institute occupied an entire floor of Columbia University's medical school, with research labs, teaching facilities, and a simulation center where medical students practiced having difficult conversations with patients and families. Sophia walked through the halls that hummed with the energy of young doctors learning to prioritize truth over convenience, patient welfare over institutional pressures. At 38, she'd become one of the youngest recipients of the MacArthur Fellowship, recognized for transforming medical education and patient advocacy through innovative approaches to healthcare ethics and transparency. But the award that meant most to her hung in Margaret's old apartment, now preserved as a museum and community center, a child's drawing from Maria Santos, age 8, showing her singing on stage with the words, "Truth and music make everything better." The apartment had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by medical students, patient advocates, and families who wanted to understand how one elderly woman's determination and one young woman's courage had changed an entire system. Margaret's kitchen table still held her journals, her careful notes about fighting for justice one question at a time. "Ms. Chen Morrison?" A young voice interrupted her thoughts.
Sophia turned to find a medical student, probably 22 years old, with the earnest expression of someone wrestling with difficult questions. Yes? I'm David Park, first-year med student. I wanted to thank you for creating the ethics simulation program. It's helping me understand that being a good doctor isn't just about medical knowledge, it's about being honest with patients, even when the truth is complicated. Sophia smiled, remembering her own struggles with complex truths and the courage it took to speak them. What made you want to become a doctor? My little sister died when I was 12. Experimental cancer treatment that the doctors said was her best hope. It wasn't until years later that I learned that the treatment had never properly been tested, that the doctors were being paid to use it, that traditional treatments might have saved her life. The familiar story hit Sophia like it always did. Another family destroyed by the system she'd helped expose and reform. Another life that could have been saved if truth had mattered more than profit. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, meaning it completely. What was your sister's name? Amy. Amy Park. She loved to sing, wanted to be on Broadway someday. David's voice carried the weight of dreams interrupted and promises broken. Amy's story matters, Sophia told him. Every story matters. That's why we do this work, so that future children get to grow up and chase their dreams instead of becoming cautionary tales about medical corruption. As David walked away, Sophia felt the familiar presence that had guided her through every major decision of the past decade. Margaret's voice, Eleanor's determination, and the voices of all the children whose lives had been cut short by systems that valued profits over people. 15 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States was hearing oral arguments in Chen Morrison Foundation versus Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a case that would determine whether pharmaceutical companies could be held liable for deaths that occurred during experimental trials conducted without proper informed consent. Sophia sat in the gallery, watching lawyers argue principles that cost her family everything and given her life meaning. The case had begun when the foundation discovered that Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a reconstituted version of the original Meridian Group, was conducting experimental trials
Developing countries using the same tactics that had killed children in American hospitals decades earlier. The legal battle had taken 5 years to reach the Supreme Court, but the precedent it would set could protect vulnerable populations worldwide. Justice Maria Elena Rodriguez, former Representative Rodriguez, now in her second year on the court, asked the question that went to the heart of the matter. Counsel, are you arguing that pharmaceutical companies have no obligation to ensure that experimental subjects understand the risks they're accepting? Meridian's attorney, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide his obvious discomfort, replied with the kind of legal technicalities that had allowed the original conspiracy to flourish for decades. But Sophia could see in the justice's expressions that the moral clarity of the case was overwhelming its legal complexities. During the lunch recess, Sophia walked the Supreme Court steps with Maria Santos, now Dr. Maria Santos, Chief of Pediatric Cardiology at Columbia University Children's Hospital and one of the country's leading voices for medical ethics in pediatric care. Whatever the court decides, Maria said, we've already won the real victory. No medical school in America graduates doctors who haven't completed ethics training based on your mother's investigation. No pharmaceutical company can conduct trials without independent oversight. The system has changed. But it's not enough, Sophia replied, thinking about the children in developing countries who were still vulnerable to exploitation. It's never enough until every child, everywhere, has advocates who can't be bought or intimidated. That evening, the court released its decision, a unanimous ruling that pharmaceutical companies conducting experimental treatments had legal obligations to ensure meaningful, informed consent and could be held liable for deaths that resulted from inadequate disclosure of risks. The decision cited Eleanor Morrison's investigation extensively, noting that, quote, the courage of individual whistleblowers has historically been essential to protecting public health from corporate malfeasance. 20 years later,
The Margaret Chen Global Health Institute had become one of the world's leading organizations for medical ethics and patient advocacy, with offices in 23 countries and partnerships with hundreds of hospitals, medical schools, and patient advocacy organizations. Sophia, now 48, split her time between New York and Geneva working with international health organizations to implement safety protocols that protected vulnerable populations from medical exploitation. It was work that Margaret would have understood immediately, using privilege and resources to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. On a warm September evening, Sophia stood in the renovated Margaret Chen Community Health Center in Chinatown, addressing an audience of medical students, patient advocates, and community members gathered for the annual Eleanor Morrison Memorial Lecture. The center had expanded to occupy an entire city block, providing comprehensive health care, social services, and advocacy training to immigrant communities throughout New York. 20 years ago, she began, my grandmother left me more than money. She left me evidence of systematic corruption that was killing children and destroying families. She also left me an example of how one person's determination to seek truth and demand justice can change systems that seem too powerful to challenge. In the audience, she saw faces that represented the best of what they'd built together. Dr. Maria Santos, now in her 30s, and training the next generation of pediatric cardiologists to prioritize ethics alongside technical skills. James Wellington, now 82 and still practicing law with the energy of someone half his age. Richard, approaching 70 but still working as a patient advocate, having found redemption through service to the families he'd once failed. The Margaret Chen Protocols have been implemented in over 2,000 hospitals worldwide. Medical schools on 6 continents require ethics training based on my mother's investigation. International law now recognizes patient advocacy as a fundamental human right.
She paused, thinking about Margaret's journey from rural China to New York's Chinatown, about Eleanor's courage in confronting powerful institutions, about all the children who were alive today because people had refused to accept that their deaths were acceptable costs of medical progress. But our work isn't finished, she said. Every time a pharmaceutical company prioritizes profits over safety, every time a doctor accepts financial incentives that compromise patient care, every time a family is pressured into experimental treatments without understanding the risks, Margaret's fight continues. After the lecture, Sophia walked through Chinatown's familiar streets, past the restaurant where Margaret had worked nights while Sophia did homework, past the school where her grandmother had attended English classes well into her 70s, past the small park where they'd sat on summer evenings, sharing stories about brave women who changed the world one courageous choice at a time. She stopped at Margaret's grave in Queens, where the headstone read simply, Margaret Chen, 1928-2019. She taught her granddaughter that silence is never golden when children are suffering. The inscription had been Sophia's choice, but the flowers were fresh, placed there, she knew, by one of the dozens of families whose lives had been changed by Margaret's legacy. Medical students left flowers when they graduated, patients left flowers when treatment succeeded, children left drawings and letters thanking Ms. Margaret for keeping them safe. As the sun set over New York City, Sophia felt the familiar presence of the women who'd shaped her understanding of courage, justice, and love. Margaret's voice reminding her that truth was like water, always finding a way to surface. Eleanor's determination to protect children she'd never met. Her own voice joining the chorus of people who refused to accept that systemic injustice was inevitable or unchangeable. The next morning, Sophia's phone rang with news of a new pharmaceutical scandal in Southeast Asia, experimental vaccines being tested on children without parental consent, safety data being suppressed, and government officials being bribed to approve dangerous treatments. It was exactly the kind of call she'd been receiving for 20 years, and exactly the kind of fight Margaret had prepared her to wage. "Maria," she said, calling Dr. Santos with the energy of someone who'd found her life's purpose and never tired of pursuing it. "We have work to do."
Because the fight for truth, justice, and children's lives was never finished. It was only passed from one generation to the next, carried forward by people who understood that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that inherited wealth came with inherited responsibility, and that one person's courage to speak truth could change systems that seemed immutable. Margaret's granddaughter had learned her lessons well, and somewhere in a children's hospital, a medical school, or a community health center, the next generation was learning them too.